All right. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for attending the talk on usability testing in open source software. Just to introduce myself, so I'm Jim Hall, and I've been in open source software since about 1993, but more recently in usability of open source software. It started when I was at the University of Minnesota, and I was getting my master's degree, and really got excited about usability testing. And I wanted to combine my background in open source software with what I was now learning about usability testing. And there wasn't a lot, and still aren't a lot of people doing studies of usability testing in open source software. And so it's something I've been very excited to do. And in fact, after getting my master's, I actually worked with the Outreachy and with GNOME as part of their internship program to mentor some interns doing usability testing on GNOME. And in fact, today I'll be going over a little bit of some of the results as sort of a demonstration of what results actually look like. You can see on screen my email addresses if you'd like to reach out to me there. I also have a copy of these slides up on the system if you want to download them on your own. So starting with the question, what is usability? So when we think about what is usability, a lot of people kind of have variety of definitions about what is usability. And it gets conflated with user experience, which is certainly very related to that. But if I'm going to try and create just a brief definition of what is usability, it's really about three things. It's about real people doing real tasks in a reasonable amount of time. So if you've got people that actually are real people who can use your software to get real work done, and they can figure it out and use it and complete their tasks in a reasonable amount of time, it's probably got good usability. There are experiences, by the way, you can actually have a program that has good usability, but a bad user experience. And you can also have things that have a good user experience, but bad usability. Those are edge cases. In most cases, if you've got good usability, you probably have a good user experience. User experience is more about what's the emotional attachment to the software. What, as they leave the software, as they stop using the software, how excited are they to use it again? But usability is really back to that real people doing real tasks in a reasonable amount of time. And so then you might ask, well, how do I get good usability, right? How do I know if my program has good usability? And it really comes down to doing usability testing. So when do you do usability testing, right? That's always the first question. When should I be doing usability testing? The best time to do usability testing is before you've released it, or while you're working on, or before you do development, or while you're doing the development. Don't stick it at the end as part of your other testing, your system testing or whatever else. Do it way up front. Because if you have any changes that you need to make to the interface or to workflow or things like that, it's a lot easier to make those changes when you haven't done a lot of work on the system yet. So at the beginning, you might do a usability test on what's called a paper prototype, where you literally would print out some sheets of paper with a mock-up of what the interface might look like. It doesn't need to be what I would call a high fidelity mock-up. It doesn't actually need to look like pixel perfect as to what it's going to look like. In some cases, people have actually done paper prototype testing with things that have been just drawn out with some, pen on paper just by hand. It doesn't actually have to be something you put into a drawing program, to the GIMP or Ink Master or something, and try and create a really high fidelity mock-up of what it's going to look like. Just something that represents what the interface is going to look like. That's really what you need, and that's called a paper prototype test, when you're actually giving somebody some sheets of paper and saying, so here's what the interface is going to look like, and I'm going to ask you to do some things. And what would you click? What would, just like tap on here to indicate what you would click to, try and complete this task. We actually did this kind of testing with GNOME during one of our cycles in Outreachy, where we're working on a new version of settings. The GNOME design team, we're working on a new version of the settings app. And so our intern did a paper prototype test with people and asked those testers, here's something that you might need to do. What would you click on? Just tap on the thing that you would click on the first thing that you would try to click on. And so then that was sort of an experiment of, how close could they get, right? Was how many people actually were guessing it correctly based on its name or description or something else. But also it's interesting to, when you do this paper prototype test, the very, very beginning, it's interesting to see how people are going to use your application. But regardless of how you are doing this paper prototype test or what information you're getting back, basically you're going to do it more than once. So you're going to create a design of some kind. You can, like in this case, a paper mock-up. You print it out on paper. You do your usability test. And then based on what people are doing with that paper prototype, you might go back and modify a little bit, right? Okay, well, they were trying to click on some weird part of the screen that I don't have any controls over there, and they were looking over there for something. All right, so I'm going to modify the interface so that way I can put some buttons over there that they look for. And then you're going to do another usability test. And then you'd go back and do another update. And in my experience, after 2 or 3 of these iterations, where you create a design, do a usability test, and do a tweak, after 2 or 3 iterations, in my experience, you generally have an interface that works pretty well for most people. And the other time you might do a usability test is during the development, right? So while you're developing the application, you're going to want to do a usability test while you actually have something working. It might not be a bug-free version, but it's at least a version that's working. And so it's the same concept, right? You're testing the actual design. And interestingly, the process is the same. So you're going to create that design, the working prototype here, the working model, and you're going to do usability test on it. And you go back and say, okay, based on what I learned from the usability test, what are some things that I could change to make this easier to use? Then you go back and do another usability test. And then based on those results, you go back and do maybe another tweak. And then you can, probably go from there. Because again, my experience is after 2 or 3 of those iterations, you probably have figured out what are the major issues that people are having. And you can make it really easy for most people to use. And so the question is, okay, so who can do usability testing? Do I need to get a lab? No, you don't need to get a lab. A lot of people think you need to have a usability lab, some expensive place to be. You don't actually have to do that. And so, well, actually, that's like sort of like, you don't actually have to go and like outsource to a lab or something. You can do it on your own. But you are not the person who can evaluate your system to determine if it's usable. So when I say in here, who can do usability testing, not you, it means that you can't go in and determine, on your own by clicking around, is this easy for other people to use? That's because you've been developing it, right? You know all the ins and outs of the application. You know exactly how to use it, what the edge cases are. You know what all the menus are, what if you've got keyboard shortcuts, you know exactly what they do. So you are not a good person to actually go in and like sort of figure some stuff out and click around, just by clicking around, say, oh yeah, I think this is something that most people can use. And so if you aren't the person who can actually just on your own figure out if it's got good usability, then who is that? Well, that's going to be somebody else. So you need to have somebody else who's going to be your tester for usability testing. You're still going to be what's called the moderator. You're the one actually giving them these tasks. I'm going to talk about that in a second. But you need somebody else who's a representative of your users. Somebody who's a real person, they're doing real tasks, and you're going to see if they can do it in a reasonable amount of time. And so this means, if you're creating an application that is, let's say, an IDE for a developer, well, you want to get some other developer to do testing for you. You don't want to just get some general user. So you want to make sure you match the tester to the audience, the people who are going to be using that application. And so how do you do usability testing? Well, that's really what we're going to talk about here, right? So there's really 5 steps to doing usability testing. You first need to create what are called personas. Some people will skip this, and you can get away with it if you skip it, but it makes it so much easier if you create personas. I'm going to go through what each one of these means in just a second. So create those personas. It's basically a description of who is using the system. And then define the use scenarios. Again, a lot of people try to skip the use scenarios piece. And You could probably get through it if you don't use scenarios. But again, it's going to be so much easier to do everything else if you are doing the personas and the use scenarios. And then you're going to define what are called scenario tasks. I'll talk about that in a minute. And then you're going to do your test, because the scenario tasks are actually what you're going to use in your test. And then once you've done your test, you can do an analysis, which I'll tell you how to do that as well. And then from there, you can kind of figure out what are the rough spots, right? What's working out really well and what things maybe need to change. But the key is really that you're going to watch somebody else use your system. And it's not even just one person. We'll actually talk about that. It's more than just one person, but how many people do you need? Spoiler alert, you only need 5 to do testing for usability. So you don't need a lab. You can do it on your own. And I'm going to tell you how to do it. So first are personas. So you need to understand who is using your system. And I find that it's best to just document this, right? Just write a paragraph, a good paragraph. Describe people who are using your system. It's going to be a fictional user, certainly, but you need to make it feel real. If other people who are working on this project with you would read the persona and they would say, yeah, I totally know people. I totally know people that you described in that persona. I can totally imagine people like exactly like that using my system. Then you know you've created a good persona. I would also include a photo. It doesn't have to be a photo of like a real person like at a conference or something. You can go online and find different sources for publicly accessible, like Creative Commons Zero photographs. You'll see in this presentation, I use a lot of stuff from Pexels.com. They're Creative Commons Zero, but include a photo of somebody, because that makes it feel more real. People will project and say that, oh, yeah, that's a real person because there's a photo with it. It really is amazing what happens to people when they're reading a persona that has a photo versus one that doesn't have a photo. Because if it has a photo, then people will sort of view that as more real because there's a person attached to it. But another reason you want to create these personas is not just to understand your users. That understanding users is very, very important. But it's also a discussion point. So as you're making change, as you're talking about what changes you would want to make on the software, it allows you to talk about changes that you would make that are going to benefit certain people. You're no longer talking about, I want to make this change because I think this is a cool thing to do, right? I mean, you're probably going to have that conversation anyway, but you're not going to have conversations that are sort of, I've described as more emotional, where you're saying, I want to make this change because I think it's a cool thing to do. You're saying, I want to make this change because this is going to benefit people like Sarah, the persona Sarah. This is going to benefit people like Steve. This is going to benefit people like Banjari, right? It's going to benefit specific people. And by having these personas, you can actually describe people who use your system. And you need to represent all users on your system, right? In order to be able to have that conversation, you'd be able to represent all the users in the system. And maybe you've got a pretty narrow, audience for who's going to use that system. It might be just developers, in which case that's a pretty easy set to define, although there's a lot of different use cases for that. So maybe it would be a little bit more difficult, but that's a more targeted audience base. Or it might be just people who are creatives. People are going to be creating, videos, or people who are going to be creating digital art, right? Depending on the application. So maybe you've got a more narrowly defined audience, or you might be creating something like GNOME, which is a more general use application, right? Everybody needs to be able to use the desktop, or they're not going to get anywhere. In which case, I would recommend saying, okay, well, let's maybe take a grid approach, and that's what I've got on the right-hand side. Is you might have a grid that says, all right, I've got experience on the left-hand side going up, and I've got age on the right. So whatever age range you want to come up with, there's your age range. And then as long as you can sort of, through all of your usability testing, make it a check mark in at least one of those boxes, across all of your testing, probably make a checkbox in all of those boxes, then you're probably covering your user base pretty well. But you should certainly have a persona that it would fit into each one of those boxes. So for example, someone who is college aged and has a lot of experience, or someone who's college aged with not a lot of experience, or someone who's college aged who just wants to use a computer and they don't want anything to get in the way. So you want to use that experience and age box that I've got up there, if you've got a more general audience, to kind of guide what personas you would need to create. And so my recommendation for something like more general audience like GNOME, or a web browser, or an email client, would be, you would want to define 9 different personas, one that would fit in each one of those boxes. And so that's why you do personas. But what's a persona look like? So a persona might look like this, right? So this is a persona that I had written up as an example for a different conference. And so Todd. And so Todd, age 16, him, is a high school student who's getting interested in open source software. And at his school's computer club, a friend showed him Fedora running GNOME on one of the lab PCs. And Todd is learning about computers and still getting started with GNOME and the apps. And that, you got a photo on the right-hand side, and this describes a real person. I don't know specifically Todd. This is certainly a public domain photograph, so I don't even know the person that the photo was taken of. But if you use GNOME or any desktop, I think you would agree that there is somebody out there that this Todd persona describes. You got other ones too. So Stevie, age 24, pronouns they, them, is a marketer for a mid-sized company. And they have used Windows until recently, but they would have had to buy a new computer to run Windows 11. And so one of the web developers at the company suggested Stevie try Linux and GNOME. And after running the live image, they made the switch. So Stevie is experienced with computers, but new to GNOME. And I definitely know people that are just like Stevie. That describes a lot of people that I've met and worked with. I'm not going to read all these examples, but I will read one more. Maria, age 33, pronouns she, her, is a web developer for an online retailer. And Maria has run Linux since she was an undergraduate computer science student, and she was a GNOME 2 user, but switched to KDE after GNOME 3. After reading articles about GNOME 40, Maria would like to try GNOME again, and she's very familiar with Linux distributions, but is relearning GNOME. And so again, you're seeing a name attached to every one of these personas. You're seeing a photograph attached to each one, and you're describing a person in real terms, right? This isn't some, it's a fictional thing. Definitely it's a fictional thing. But I know people like Maria. And I'm hoping that as you were reading these, that you'd say, I know somebody like Maria as well, right? You probably know somebody just like Dan. You probably know somebody just like Jessica. These slides, by the way, are already uploaded in the system. So you can download these slides if you want to view the text on your own later on. But these are examples of personas that you would want to create that describe a real person. They're fictional, but they're describing somebody in real terms that you could actually believe this is somebody that is using the software. And it, again, allows you to have discussions and say, well, we could make a change that would benefit people like Jessica, or it's going to benefit people like Maria, rather than saying, I want to make this change because I think this is kind of a cool thing to do. And so once you've defined your personas, the next step is to take those personas and describe use scenarios. I would recommend at least one use scenario per persona, but you certainly could create more than one. So what's a use scenario? A use scenario is just describing how they use the system, right? You're describing a little story, right? The who, what, where, and why of why they're using the software. And if time is important, you would put when in there as well. It's a brief story, right? Why are they using the system? What are they trying to do? Where are they? Why did they even start the application, right? So what's the story behind this person in this photo? You could create a variety of different use scenarios based on this photograph. It could be somebody who's working from home, and she has booted up her laptop in her apartment, and she's trying to do remote work, at the office from home. Or this person could just be opening up her laptop on a Sunday afternoon and they want to check news, go on social media, do whatever they want to do. This could just be sort of a casual use. Or this person also has headphones on. So this person could be turning on their computer so they can watch a video online, or they could listen to an audiobook, or maybe they just want to do a little coding while listening to some music on a personal project, right? So it could be any kind of those use scenarios. You could define a use scenario that would sound like any one of those. And I think that you would agree that those use scenarios I just described, I think feel very real, right? Why is that person using that software? What is that person trying to do? And so you'd want to describe, what is that person trying to do? Well, here I'm describing probably the GNOME desktop, but if you're talking about, let's say an IDE, then you probably want to say, okay, what kind of project are they working on? How many files are they working with? What's their deadline? What programming language, right? Things like that. You're describing the use, the scenario of use of how they're going to use the system. So why are they doing it? So it's a brief little story. Again, it's fictional, and you'd want to attach it to one of those personas. So that way we're feeling how real this is, an extension of that persona. It's fictional, but it needs to feel real. And so by the time you're done with that, when other people who are using the system, or other people who are helping to develop the system, would want to read that use scenario and say, yep, that sounds like people who are using the software. And once you've done that, you can go on to create what are called scenario tasks. Sometimes these are called just tasks. And this is the heart of your usability test. When you wonder about what does my usability test look like, this is it. Your usability task is a series of these scenario tasks. So your usability test is just a bunch of these scenario tasks put together. And a scenario task by itself, you can create, once you understand your users, right? You've defined your users with personas, you understanding what they're doing through these use scenarios. And that allows you to come back and say, okay, based on what I know about that person and how they're using it, this is a specific task that they're going to do as part of that use scenario. And a good scenario task, I will also say this, by the way, scenario tasks seem to be the hardest thing for most people to do the first time they're doing usability testing. So if this part takes you a little bit of time, that's okay. But a scenario task, it needs to set a brief context and then ask the tester to do something specific. And that sounds like an easy thing to do, right? It's a brief context and then ask them to do something specific. It's probably 2 sentences. But the challenge is that you can't give them any accidental hints. When you're describing the scenario task, you don't want to reuse terminology that's used in the program. So the exact menu item, you don't want to say, go and find the page with a button labeled this, right? That's not a good scenario task. That's not something that a real person would do, right? Remember, we're going back to real people doing real tasks. And so they're not going to approach a task as, I'm going to look for a button labeled specifically this. But if the action that they're trying to do is to print something to a printer, then you're probably going to say, print this to a printer. Right? That would be the action you ask them to do that's very specific. And then the context you put up before that could be whatever you need to do to make it happen. You could say, well, you're ready to print this document so you can bring it to a meeting, and so print this to the printer. And so that's a very short scenario task. And you need to make it real, right? You're not going to make it something that's going to be very esoteric. It's going to be very theoretical. It needs to be very concrete. It needs to feel like something that real people would do. And so what does a scenario task look like? So I've kind of described what a scenario task is, but a scenario task actually looks like, here's an example, for a text editor. And these are actual scenario tasks that I used or my interns used when we did usability testing for Outreachy. And so for a text editor, this originally was the usability scenario task we used for gedit. You want to finish writing a draft of a blog post that you're using on a project. And you start the text editor, and that's been done for you because we're not testing if you can launch the application. We're testing the application. So you start the text editor, that's been done for you. Please open the file blogpostdraft.txt from the documents folder. And so we've described the context. A brief context is that you want to finish writing a draft of a blog post you're working on, and you started the text editor. That's the context. And then you're asking them to do something specific. Please open this specific file from this directory. And which, by the way, means when you do your usability test, you need to have that file on that in that directory somewhere. And so this is something that, because it's specific, we know that you should know it while you're observing somebody use the software. Did they actually do that, right? It should be very obvious. Yep, they brought up the blog post draft.txt file in the documents folder. And I think your tester would agree as well, right? So your tester has been given this scenario task, one task at a time. I'll talk about when we do testing next, but they'll get this scenario task one task at a time. And they're going to do that one task. And then when they're done, they're going to turn to you and say, okay, I've done this one, right? So I've opened the file from the documents folder. And in your notes, because you're taking notes, yep, you'd say, yep, they were able to do it. Or another one might be that some of the names in this document are incorrect. Replace every occurrence of Applejack with Fluttershy and all instances of Rainbow Dash with Twilight Sparkle. I wrote this scenario task when My Little Pony Friendship is Magic was very popular on television. So this, again, is setting up a brief context. Some of these names are incorrect in the document. That's the context. And then the thing you're asking to do that's very specific is replace every occurrence of Applejack with Fluttershy and every occurrence of Rainbow Dash with Twilight Sparkle. And for a very brief document, that would be like, let's say, a paragraph long, you're going to see testers do a variety of different things. You might see one tester that's going to go through and just sort of scan the one paragraph that's in that document and say, okay, well, as I see Applejack, I'm replace it with Fluttershy. As I see Rainbow Dash, I'm replace it with Twilight Sparkle. Or you can see other people going to do a find replace. And so what are you trying to test in this? Are you trying to test their ability to find, or somebody's going to probably do like Control F. Somebody else might do Control F to try and find a specific instance and just replace them that way. And so what are you trying to test? Are you trying to test the find replace feature? You're trying to test the Control F? What are you trying to test? In this case, we're trying to test if people could do find replace text. And so we needed to have a test document that was quite long. And so scale your test data appropriately. And so I had grabbed an article that I had written on my blog about leadership lessons from unusual places, and it had a number of instances where Fluttershy and Twilight Sparkle were meeting for the very first time. If you remember that show, and I intentionally replaced the names with Applejack and Rainbow Dash, but the names occurred a lot, and it was not a short document. It was pretty long, and so this, if you wanted to try and scan through the document and try and find each name on your own, go for it. That would tell us one thing. Maybe some people prefer to do that. If people want to do Control F to do just highlight the instances and again change them on their own, that'd be fine too. But most testers just went for find replace because they're like, that's going to be the easiest to do. And so that's a scenario task. Another one might be this one. So it's again for when we did the testing for GNOME Calendar, a client has asked to meet with you at their office next week. So add an event called Meeting with Client to the calendar for next week on Thursday at 10 a.m. So we're setting up a brief context and ask them to do something specific. I think that you would agree when you're observing somebody using the calendar, they've created a Meeting with Client event and at the correct day and time. Or your boss just reminded you about an important conference you need to attend August 15 to 18, and you've already planned a trip around that time. So we want to check if you're free to attend the conference. Please check your calendar, because in this application, we had put events on the calendar already. Check your calendar to see when you have your vacation and if you're able to attend the conference. So again, we're setting up that brief context about your boss has reminded you about this conference and what the dates are, and you want to check if you're free. That's the context. And then the specific thing you've asked them to do is to check the calendar and see when their vacation is. And testers are able to go in and see that the vacation was scheduled for the week after the conference. So they're able to say, oh, yep, looks like I'm free, 15 to 18. And so that's an example of scenario tasks. So again, this slide deck is uploaded to the system, so you can download these. This is another examples up here for if you're doing a file manager or if you're doing a web browser. But the key here is you're trying to not reuse terminology that's used on the application. So for example, for a web browser, there was a menu item at this time called font, and for change font size. And when we wrote the scenario task, we'd be very careful not to use the term font. You don't have your glasses with you, so it's hard to read the text on the website. So make the text bigger on the website. You're not reusing the term font. So let's talk about doing the test. So doing the test, how many people do you need to be in your test? And the answer is 5, right? So there's some math behind this. But basically, if there's some experimental evidence that kind of suggests that one tester can find about 31% of the usability issues on any product. One tester can find about 31% of the issues. And there's going to be some overlap. And so how many testers do you need to make this a really successful test? About 5, because that gets you above 80% of the usability issues found, which if you're doing this sort of iterative, you're doing a usability test and you're making a change, doing a usability test, making another change, right? 5 testers at a time is good enough. So you don't need a lot. And if you want proof, right, here's visualization of what that looks like. So you can do this experiment on your own. I've got a gray square here that represents 100%. And the red square on here represents 31% of that gray square. It really does. And the source code for this is also in the slide deck. And if I do some random placement of different numbers of red squares, one red square, I'm covering up any 31% of the gray. For 2, I've covered up, each square is covering up 31%, but there's an overlap, right? The 2 testers will find the same issues, but they're also going to find each one's going to find some different issues. Same for 3, right? Each one of these is a random run. So same for 3 testers. You're going to have, each tester is going to find the same issues that the other testers found, but they're also going to find some issues on their own. 4 and then 5 testers. And you covered a lot of the gray square with 5 testers. If you try to say, well, more is better, right? Oh, well, more is better. And certainly if you want to publish academically, you want to have more, but you don't want to publish academically. You want to just find the issues on the system. Look at that. 10 doesn't have much more of the area covered than 5. And yet that's twice the effort. 15 doesn't have a lot more of the space covered than 10. 20 doesn't have a lot more covered than 15. So, think about basically the return on investment, right? You're putting in some time, and then how fast are you gonna get results? This is the source code I mentioned, by the way. You can find that in the slide deck. And then you're going to do your test. And as I mentioned, doing the test is just feeding your tester these scenario tasks one at a time. And then you're going to observe them, right? You're going to do the test, and you're going to take notes while they're doing the test. So encourage them to do what's called the speak aloud protocol. So as they're doing the test, you want to make sure that you're encouraging them to speak aloud. If they're looking for a button that says print, they should be saying, "I'm looking for a button that says print," right? Because you can't know what's going on inside their head. So if they're speaking out loud, they can tell you, "I'm looking for a button called test." Or a button called print. And so, that allows you to follow along what's going on inside their head. When you've done the test, these 5 testers, then you need to do an analysis. And this is the really cool part. And so what you're going to do is, what I find useful is to create what's called a heat map. It's a heat map grid. There's different ways you could describe this, but I happen to call it a heat map because the colors are sort of representing different levels of, I would say, heat. So what you're doing here is representing just an abbreviation of each scenario task on each row, right? So for the Photos app, in this case, this was Renata's usability test. The first one was creating an album in GNOME Photos, and then doing a favorite of a photo, and then deleting a photo and editing a photo, right? So you're describing just a brief summary of each one of those was. And then each column represents a separate tester. And so in this case, Renata did, looks like I'm gonna say 12 testers, I think. And so each tester gets a column. Now, you only need to do 5, but in this case, we did more than 5. And then you're gonna color code each one of those cells. So where each tester and scenario task meet, you're gonna put a color that indicates how easy or how hard that task was for somebody to do. If they didn't have any problems at all, if it was really easy for them to do, put in green, right? A nice cool color, you're gonna put in green. If they had some problems, trying to do the scenario task, they clicked around a little bit, but it wasn't too hard. They're gonna do, you're gonna do yellow. If it was harder than that, they're gonna do orange. If it was much harder, they're gonna do red. And if they couldn't do it at all, they're gonna do black. And that allows you to look across and try and find hot rows, right? So you can see here, what are the scenario tasks that were the most difficult for users to do? Well, if I were the person working on these applications, this is what we came back for recommendations. If I were the person working on the app, I would say I would focus most on creating an album and adding a new calendar in the calendar app. I wouldn't worry too much about setting a photo as a background image. I mean, that could be second level priority, but if I wanted a third one, I'd probably be looking at adding an online account in the calendar. Another one that we had is this one for Nautilus, the file manager. Very difficult at that time during Gina's test for people to save a file location, a folder location, a bookmark, basically. And so that was something that needed a lot of attention at that time. It's gotten better since. In events, right, adding a note to a document that contained a check mark, or saving a title's location, right? Basically bookmarking inside a PDF. And so by looking at these colors, you can see what the hot rows are and where people struggled the most. And that allows you to go back with your notes that you took during the usability test to kind of understand, okay, not just they had a lot of difficulty with this one, but where were they trying to look? And you might even ask them at the end of the test, I saw that you were having difficulty with this one, trying to find, let's say, the print button. Where were you looking? What would have made that easier? And with that kind of feedback, together with this heat map, you can understand where you need to make improvements and what improvements you need to make. And by the way, even though, again, even Gina's test, we did, looks like another, maybe I'm going to say 12 people, any 5 of these testers would have been enough to understand the usability of these applications. So really only need 5 if you're going to make iterative changes to an application. Anyway, that's sort of my brief introduction to usability testing in open source software. It's really easy to do. And so I'll take what time I have left here to answer questions, but I'm going to leave you with this quote that, make your program's purpose and structure clear. You don't want to make use your creativity, create beautiful obstacles to learning. So that's the brief introduction to usability, and from there I'll take any questions we have in the remaining time.
All right, thank you. Let's applaud first. That was a great talk. Thanks. I'm going to use holding the mic privilege to ask a question from online. Where Pro Bono is asking, do you know any good software to do usability test over the internet using a webcam and screen sharing? Basically the setup we've got right now.
Yes, and in fact, that's how a lot of testing is actually done in industry right now, is doing it through what's called a remote usability test. Any kind of video meeting platform that allows the other person on the other end to share their desktop will do the job, because it allows you to watch where they're moving, and you can probably even see where they're moving their mouse. If I move my mouse on this here, you can see the little red dot seeing where I'm moving my mouse. And so if I were doing a usability test, you could see me move the mouse all around the screen and what menus I was clicking on and whatnot. So really any kind of video meeting software will do, whether that's a Big Blue Button or Zoom or Jitsi or Blue Jeans or whatever you want to use, as long as you can see their desktop, that'll do the job.
All right, thank you. Other questions from here in the room? Yes, there's a question here in the room.
It's a fast question. When someone speaks aloud, doesn't that interfere with what he's doing?
My experience has been no. It feels a little awkward for that person the first task they do, maybe the first 2 tasks they do, and after that it sort of becomes not quite natural, but it's something that doesn't seem to interfere with what they're doing. It's sort of like stream of consciousness. If I'm thinking about it, then I'm going to talk about it because I did the first 2 tasks that way. And so you might, for example, give them 2 scenario tasks that you don't really care about that much. Like like maybe opening a file, if you think that's a pretty obvious thing for them to do. And that way they're getting some experience, some exercise in speaking out loud and saying, okay. And that allows you to also say, okay, you're not speaking out loud, right? You click on something, but what can you tell me what you're clicking on, what you're looking for? And then, oh, okay, I'm looking for a menu item that lets me open something. So I'm just going to click on this menu here, and that allows them to kind of, with that first 1 or 2 scenario tasks, to kind of get adjusted to speaking out loud. But no, my experience has been it doesn't interfere with them actually doing the test itself.
All right, thanks. We got one final question from online from the Matrix chat, who's from L. Baxum, who says, nice talk. Have you also needed to do accessibility testing?
So accessibility testing is different. And the process is very similar, but it is a different sort of a thing. So what we're talking about for accessibility, for those who don't know, usability is about real people doing real tasks in a real amount of time. Accessibility is how you're allowing everybody to use the software regardless of their level of access. So it could be something like somebody has difficulty using their right hand, and maybe they have tremor, and so difficulty in clicking on menu items, or it could be that they're colorblind. In fact, a lot of people are colorblind, and so are they able to interpret what's happening on the screen, or are you relying purely on color? And so it's a different sort of a test that you're doing there, but the approach is very similar in how you're going to design the test in terms of who's using it and what things you need them to do. But the actual test itself will be a little different there, because you're focusing specifically on can you see the software. For example, Firefox has a developer plugin that allows you to test on a website and see if and emulate these different kinds of color blindness. And so if you want to test if your website is something that someone who's colorblind is able to use, you can test for different types of color blindness. And it, by the way, is very interesting how many websites out there assume you have full color range. And as soon as you are not able to see color, you're only able to see black and white, the website becomes extremely, monumentally hard to use. Of course, my father-in-law is also legally blind, and so there's visual issues as well. And so on a website, do you have the right atria hints and things like that? But the short version is how you design the test is the same, but how you execute the test will be a little bit different.
All right, thank you. Real tasks for real people, and real people need accessibility. I think that's the really short version. Thanks a lot, Jim. That was a great talk. You've brought our conference to a close, to a conclusion. I hope the conference was accessible and usable. We'll give you another round of applause for good answers.
Thank you.
And we hope one day